Is your offer to purchase going to include contingencies? My name is Sean Larson, real estate broker, and let's talk about contingencies. Let's start by defining what a contingency is. In real estate, a contingency is basically something that is unknown now, but something in the future depends on it. So we're going to go over some of the most common or some of the most basic contingencies that you find in real estate. They can be anything. There can be any condition placed on a future action, and that becomes a contingency. So we're just going to go over the basic and most common ones you're going to find. And probably the first one you're going to find is what's called the financial contingency. And basically what that means is if the buyer has or can get the money, they will later then purchase the home. And see, that purchase is contingent on having the funds. Now, it could be the buyer has a bucket full of cash, or they might be getting a loan. So if they have the bucket full of cash, they do have the money. They might need to provide a proof of funds letter from the bank, but their purchasing the home later is still contingent or depends on their having the money. If somebody is getting a mortgage to purchase, the contingency is that they will later have the money from the lender to purchase the home. So that contingency could last the entire contract period, because at the very end, if the lender for some reason shouldn't provide the funds, maybe the buyer lost a job or something like that, they're not going to have the funds to buy the home. So see, that deal stays contingent on that. Now keep in mind, this is completely dependent on what your contract or your purchase agreement states, because this will vary per region. Every state is going to have different boilerplated text in there. It's not to say you can't supplement that with additional conditions, but you are definitely going to want to review your contract to see what contingencies are in there or the options for you to select from, and how they're worded and what the results are. So financial contingency is a very common one. If the buyer has the funds or can get the funds, they will purchase the home. Okay, another very common contingency is an inspection contingency. And you're going to find inspection and some of these other ones, they're going to vary with how hot the market is. Because what will happen is if you get in a market that has very low inventory and very high demand, sometimes buyers will start pulling these contingencies off, if they can, in order to look better to the buyer. Now, the financial contingency, you pretty much can't pull that off in a lot of cases if you're getting a mortgage, because you need that money to buy the home. So you really can't pull that off, because otherwise at the end, you don't have the funds, you can't buy the home. But the inspection one tends to fluctuate a little bit with how hot the market is. But basically, the inspection contingency goes a little something like this. When you enter the agreement, you put in there the contingency for the inspection, and it says the buyer gets to review the home or have it inspected with all the inspectors you want, however it's worded. And then based on the results of that, the buyer gets to determine whether they want to proceed with the home purchase or not. A little something like that. Now, there can be different versions of that, so again, check and see how yours is worded. Just because you have a contingency on there doesn't mean that the seller is obligated to any type of repair or anything like that resulting from the inspections. That's a whole other discussion. This contingency just says that the buyer has the right to inspect and evaluate the results, and the rest depends on your contract, where it goes from there. And brings up a good point. Anytime you have a contingency like that, you always want to be aware of what the else is, what happens later. If there's a performance deadline, if there's a performance stipulation of what happens, you want to be sure you know what that is. Does the buyer have a right to do something? Does the contract auto-terminate? So anytime you have a contingency like that, you want to be very aware of what happens later. Okay, another contingency that is pretty popular is appraisal. Now, this will vary as well based on how the home is being purchased. You might have a buyer that has a bucket full of cash and they want to purchase the home. They may or may not have an appraisal done. Just because they're paying cash doesn't mean that they don't want to know the value of the home to ensure they're not overpaying. So sometimes people will think, oh, they're paying cash, they don't need an appraisal. Not necessarily. Sometimes they also want to have one to ensure they're not overpaying for the home. Now, if you're getting a mortgage to purchase the home, chances are really high that the lender is going to want to have an appraisal done, because later, if something should go bad and they need to liquidate the home to recoup their money, they need to know what that home is worth. So quite often with a lending scenario, you're going to have an appraisal. And appraisal contingencies go a little something like this. Again, check your documents, but they go a little bit something like this. If the home at least appraises for the amount that the purchase agreement is for, then things proceed. If the value comes back lower than that, then something has to happen. But I'll give you this heads up, and I've had people say this in the past where I think they kind of misunderstood what happened there. They were under the impression that if the appraisal comes back lower, that becomes the new purchase price. And that is not correct unless it is written into your contract that way. But it is an assumption I've seen some people make because they either watch TV shows or something like that and they go, oh yeah, I know, if it appraises lower, that's what we pay. No, not necessarily. You need to make sure you know what your contract states, because if that's not written on the front end and an agreement between the buyer and seller, that's usually not how it works, because the seller has every right to stick with their original price. And if that buyer can't purchase for that price or doesn't want to, then things might dissolve and the seller might just wait for somebody who does want to pay that. So always be sure you know what happens later in the part of the contingency. What happens after you solve that early part of the unknown. So after that, you also have a home sale contingency. Now, sometimes in some markets, everybody's going to use some different terminology. Some markets, if they say a home is under contract, but it's contingent, well, technically, it can be contingent on anything, because like I mentioned earlier, you can write a contingency for absolutely anything. But in some markets, when they use that terminology, what they're usually meaning is the contract is contingent on a home sale. So your terminology in each market is going to vary. But a home sale contingency goes a little something like this. Somebody owns a current home. They want to purchase their new home, but they might either not want to purchase it until they sell the first one, or they have to sell the first one to pull the equity out to be able to afford the new home. So the home sale contingency goes like this. They will submit the offer to the seller of the home they wish to purchase, and part of those terms will say, basically, they will purchase the home and proceed with the contract if they are able to successfully sell and close on their current home. Now, that's loose terms on how it goes, but that basically means that, hey, if their current home doesn't sell, they are not obligated to purchase the new home. Okay, now, if you think about being in the shoes of the seller, how does that look? It looks like it could or it couldn't happen. So you're going to usually see home sale contingencies kind of in some niche scenarios. One, you're going to see it in either a balanced or a cooler market. You're not going to see as much of that in a hot market because the seller of that home figures, oh, I've got a lineup of people who want to buy my home. I don't have to accept this term of delay and chance to get my home to sale. And they're usually right. If you're in a hot market, you don't have to do those home sale contingencies. But in a balanced and a cooler market where the demand might not be as high, sellers start accommodating those a little bit more. Other niche scenarios are that the seller themselves, they might not know where they're going yet, or they might be building a home and they need some extra time. And so they might be a little more accommodating to that because it kind of fits their schedule too. Now, heads up on a home sale contingency. A lot of times when those are submitted to a seller, they might have what's called a kick-out clause in those. And basically what that says is they will accept that offer and contract with that buyer, but if another buyer comes along and is able to submit an offer without contingencies, or really just an offer that they prefer more, they then might have a window, let's say 24 or 48 hours, it's up to how the contract's written. They might have a specified amount of time to where buyer one gets first right of refusal. They can remove the contingencies and fully commit to the purchase, or that seller might be able to then dissolve that contract with buyer one and proceed with buyer two. So that is something that does occur in home sale contingencies. And again, that's called a kick-out clause, might be called something else in your region. But heads up on that if you should get into that type of scenario, that sometimes you think you have a home under contract, but you might later not if the seller has that in their contract. So as a buyer, we kind of went through these contingencies, but I really want to emphasize this. Really put yourself in the seller's shoes, because contingencies mean chance. May happen, may not happen. What do sellers want to do? Sellers want to sell their home. They don't want to sit off market and hope that something happens or hope that somebody decides to buy based on the results of something. So as you start putting more contingencies in a contract, the contract or offer doesn't look as good to sellers. And think about that. Well, they might buy my home if they can get the money. They might buy my home if the inspection comes back okay. They might buy my home if the appraisal comes back okay. They might buy my home if they can sell theirs. See how that's starting to look kind of iffy? So when you're drafting an offer to submit, keep that in mind. You don't want to give up protections. Inspection protection is awesome. Being able to go in and see the quality of that home and the condition of it. So I'm not saying waive those. I'm just saying keep in mind how that looks to a seller, and based on your market conditions, you might have to streamline some things to make your offer look really, really strong to that seller, because you may be competing with people who have fewer contingencies and they are going to look more attractive to the seller. So just a heads up on that. All right, that probably covered the kind of the basic contingencies. It can be applied to land too. If land is suitable to build, we'll buy the land. And so there are other varieties as well, but those are kind of the core contingencies that you'll see. If you have any questions at all about those, or really anything at all about real estate, please reach out to me. My name again is Sean Larson. I'm a real estate broker, and I hope you have a super day. See ya.